think that this is a really good example of why people are alleging that there's sexism in the media. Now we're gonna go over here. I'm gonna bring up a new video, and I'm gonna link it to you. And just to be clear, I don't want this to turn into a bash Anita Sarkeesian, bash the Anita Sarkeesian video. But the reason why I present her in this topic is because she gave a lot of examples, and she provided a lot of really good information. There was also a lot of people that refuted her opinions and provided a lot of good information. So we're going to take a look at one of these videos now. So this is, let me find the list for this. We're going to copy it. I'm going to post it in. Okay. There are examples. You might say that's not proof. It is proof. I would say that the examples she points out in the video games that she pointed out were good examples, and we kind of identified that in part 1 of the podcast. If you watch the highlight said post, I think you'll see some of that. So if you watch what she's saying, she's well spoken. She doesn't raise her tone. She doesn't get all exaggerative, like like some of these people, like Ann fucking Coulter does when she talks about the news. People, or Bill O'Reilly, when they decide to relate to hysterics and they start screaming to make their point like more important or some shit. I don't like it. Isn't she in her own perspective, she provides a critical look in her own way that supports her perception, and we're going to get into that more about her. But we're going to talk about another reason why. We're going to talk about why some of the examples that she listed are her as an authority figure I have a problem with. Now, a lot of people have turned to Anita Sarkeesian as a champion for female rights and female activism and feminism as a whole. I know not all feminists use Anita Sarkeesian as their voice box or soapbox, but she represents a large majority of feminists, and she talks about it. So there's the link in chat. We are on 1825 is the timestamp. Let's listen.
An observation. And finally, number 1, being a fan of video games. After beginning her video game series, Anita has said on multiple occasions that she is a fan of video games and has been playing them for most of her life.
How do you feel about video games?
I still love them. I think games are really where we're going.
Video games are so interesting and engaging and interactive. I'm a gamer and I enjoy games. I love games. I'm a fan of games.
In short, I've been playing games for most of my life.
However, in 2010, before she began her series, Anita's story was a bit different.
I'm going to show you a remix that I just finished this weekend and no one else has seen. One person has seen it. It's a soundtrack of one song, except I'm doing video games. So it's not exactly a fandom. I'm not a fan of video games. I actually have to learn a lot about video games in the process of making this.
Okay, so she's not a fan of video games. If you look at what was said in that interview of her speaking, she says, "I am not a fan of video games." Right there is documented proof of this person who is an alleged experienced person, an alleged gamer who claims to know a lot about games, claims to be a lover of video games, claims to know so much about video games, and totes herself as an authority on video games, right? Says there's documented proof that she's actually not a fan of video games. She's not a fan. But what does that have to do with what the facts she pointed out? That is also a good argument to make. The fact that she's not a fan of those video games doesn't undermine what she said in her videos. There are still instances of overless sexualization of female characters in video games, despite the fact that the supposed expert in the field knows nothing about video games. It doesn't change the fact that some of the examples that she listed is true. Now, what you can kind of argue is that this is a different of perspective. That's what it comes down to, perspective, and that's why a lot of people have problems with people like Anita Sarkeesian. That's why her name trumps up so much controversy here in the gaming community, and it affects all of us here in Twitch, because of the fact that males specifically, have been identified as, like, if you're a white male, you are a hater. You want to oppress people like Anita Sarkeesian. You hate feminists and you hate women because of the fact that you get outraged by some of the things that she said. I can tell you, but when I watched this video, her videos, I sat there and I said, okay, this is a good point she's making, but I just gave you guys like a huge list of examples of strong female characters to boot, or female protagonists in the media that are contradictory towards what she's saying. Now, she's saying that most women, her words weren't most women. She's saying that a common reoccurrent theme in the media is a damsel in distress trope. So while that might be the case, there are also examples of strong female protagonists becoming their own characters, being powerful in their own right, whether showing uncanny intellect, whether showing cleverness, whether showing an excessive a mastery of skills, or showing physical strength or strength of character. Might I add, a lot of people like Anita Sarkeesian, they focus on the aspects of Zelda is entrapped. She is an object to be acted upon, and therefore it's sexist. She's not a real character. That undermines that in and of itself, though. The fact that a woman has been victimized or held within her will or captive against her will, is that not sexist? To say that is sexist? To claim that a woman, or it is sexist to depict a woman in such a way, or perpetuates a stereotype. That also perpetuates the stereotypes or discounts the fact that women, for in many examples, are victims of assault. They are taken against their will. There are damsel in distress tropes in real life of that actually happening. And I think that discounts those people's experiences. So in this weird way, she's almost undermining her own opinion by saying that a victim is not a character. Okay, someone that needs to be rescued doesn't mean they're weak. It doesn't mean they don't contribute anything to the story. It doesn't mean that they're solely there for perpetuating a male archetype character for the process of character development. The problem is that she's using examples of video games, and she's pigeonholing the issue, and she's narrowing it down. And she's saying, no, it's sexist because of this, when there's all this other evidence right here. So just because this evidence exists in this medium, well, you can take anything, and any scientist will tell you that you can take a study and have it prove anything you want to, as long as you sample the right amount of people and you manipulate the study in such a way that it measures what you want it to measure. And in science. Within science dictates for it to be appropriate, for it to be an authentic scientific experiment. The study must gauge what it's attempting to gauge. It must be reliable. It must exemplify reliability. So, this is something I learned in my psychology classes. When you are conducting a psychological experiment, when you're conducting a medical experiment, it must be reliable in that it is attempting to measure what it's attempting to measure. And it accurately measures those things. And then it must also be valid. So just because there's a correlation, or correlation does not prove causation. So just because these two things are correlated, A and B are correlated, it does not mean that that this is the result of A and B. So just because violent offenders, let's just say somebody that goes up and shoots up their school, just because those individuals play video games that happen to be violent, it does not mean that violent video games cause violence, cause kids to go shoot up their schools. So based on these studies that we've seen time and time and again, you've seen these studies happen back during the 50s, during the McCarthy era. comic books were banned because it was alleged that scientific studies were shown that comic books aided or contributed to juvenile delinquency. That was when horror comics were a big thing, like Creep Show and a bunch of other comics that you saw. Hello, Step On. Hi, Ordinary. It's good to see you guys. Where was I going with this? I was talking about comic books. I was talking about Creep Show. I was talking about McCarthyism. Okay, so they started. That's how the comics ethics code started. And if you got comic books in the 90s or the 80s, you might remember, or like I think even the 60s and 70s, you might remember in the top left-hand corner, there was a little stamp. It looked like a stamp. And it was the stamp of approval of the comics ethics codes. What that was, what that organization was, the ethics of comic books, it was an organization that was used to censor publishers publishing comic books because they might felt like this material wasn't appropriate for children to read. And they censored the writers in creating these stories. They would say, nope, that's not good. They're talking about drugs, throw that out. Nope, I don't like that, throw that out. Nope, this person's depicted in a very sexualized way, throw that out. So we had censorship within these means, censoring people. So this is why, like when people when like a feminist like Anita Sarkeesian that says like these stereotypes in the media perpetuate these a systemic, it's a societal systemic oppression of women, or like we talk about men. Well, the difference between the arguments that are pertaining towards men and women is that maybe it's because now we're seeing much more vocalization from the female front that not necessarily made by females, that females are being oppressed. Men are also victims of gender stereotyping, but they might not make as big of a deal because they simply don't care. It really doesn't affect them that much. Watching those Magic Mike videos doesn't make me feel inadequate about myself. Like, I know that when I go into an Abercrombie store, they're targeting a very specific demographic. And they have these buff dudes sitting on their... I don't look anything like that guy. And wearing a fucking Abercrombie shirt isn't going to make me look like that guy. So I'm not going to get buff just because I wear a clothing product. And I'm not going to feel sexy just because I watch Magic Mike. By the same token, I'm not going to feel disparaged just simply because I feel that they're parading a bunch of hot dudes on stage to pander to women. You know what? The sad truth of the matter is, sex sells. And as we saw when I broke down the profit margins in Magic Mike XXL and 50 Shades of Grey, sex sells, and men aren't the only one buying it. So ironically, speaking towards Anita Sarkeesian's point, or the feminine, like I guess you would say the feminist agenda. I don't want to see. I'm not trying to sound anti-feminist because I'm not. I'm really not. Because they bring up a lot of really good points of stereotypes being portrayed. I merely feel that this is their perception of reality, and they're leaving out other relevant data or information that could sway the beliefs and opinions contrary to what they're proposing. So what I'm saying is that it affects everybody. Sexism isn't unique, and it's not exclusive towards one gender. It might affect us in different ways, subtly different ways, and maybe it might seem more common to target females and affect female in more of an apparent manner than it does men or males. But as I've said, I personally have never felt like, oh man, I feel less adequate of myself because I don't look like those guys in Magic Mike, because I don't look like that guy. Dorian, what is the guy? What is it? Not Dorian Gray. The guy in 50 Shades of Grey. Whoever that guy's name is, I don't know his name. I don't look like him. I have a pudgy body and a sunken-in chest. I have this weird, scrawny chest and this pudgy tummy. So I have a really awkward, long, elongated, weird-looking torso. I have an average-looking face, maybe arguably a little bit above average if I'm being really generous to myself. That doesn't mean, though, that I'm a super sexy guy. I'm not as handsome as Channing Tatum walking down a runway, and I'm okay with that. I don't feel inadequate about myself simply because women enjoy looking at a ripped, muscular body. If that's what